this video, we're going to create stored procedures that accept input parameters and output parameters and even work a little bit with return values. And I'm going to bet that 99% of the time, whenever you write stored procedures, that they will somehow involve an input parameter or two or three or a dozen, or an output parameter or a return value, or all three. So what I want to do, jump right into the syntax. We're going to create a new query window here. And you know, when we were writing that select statement from the previous video, I just did something like this. Select star from customers where state equals Delaware. We'll give Delaware a little love here. And hey, real short aside, you know what these little brackets are for? It's an escape sequence. It says look for a column named state or a table named state. Don't use state in the context of a SQL Server keyword, because state could be used in either way. So that's the purpose of those brackets, to clarify to SQL Server what we're talking about right now. Okay, so let's execute this. Now this is great, and if we wanted to create a stored procedure out of this, we certainly could. The problem would be it's hard-coded to Delaware. So do we just create 50 stored procedures, one for each state in the Union of the United States? No, we wouldn't do that. What we would think to do is to create some sort of variable. We would use a variable like this. And that little ampersand is just, it denotes to SQL Server that we want to work with a parameter or a variable of some sort. Okay. So how do we declare a stored procedure that accepts an input parameter that we can use to substitute for that little @state moniker? Well, we would do this. Start just like we did in the previous video. Create procedure, and I'm going to call this get customers by state. So just tacking on from our conversation of the previous video with regards to naming conventions, whenever I'm going to filter a list of things, I'll generally say what the filter is on. Unless it's just a real massive filter, then I might find some other creative way to express that. But in this case, we're only filtering on one column, the state column, so it makes sense to say get customers by state. Okay. As we're going to do the begin syntax, and whoops, that new Windows 7 stuff. There we go. And all right, and let's do a little indentation here to make it more readable. All right, so then right before the as, I'm going to declare that input parameter. So I'll do state. So I'm going to give it the keyword or the moniker that I want to use for the variable or the input parameter. And then what I'm going to do is use the Object Explorer to take a look at my customers table and take a look at the state column. And we can see here that the data type for state is nvarchar20. So I want to use that here. It makes sense to use the same data type that we've used in our table. If we didn't, there might be some sort of mismatch. We might receive information that we can't really compare against. Certainly numbers versus textual information would be a problem. But even if we had an nvarchar40, we accepted a large string of values, we would never get the results we'd expect because it's longer than the values that are stored in the table. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so let's execute this and create that object in our stored procedures folder. Let's refresh and we can see it. Awesome. Let's right click and select execute stored procedure, and you'll recall from the previous video how we could use this execute procedure dialog box to type in some value like Illinois, for example, and select OK. And what that does is it creates a ad hoc query for us that returns only those that executes our stored procedure, this get customers by state, that returns in this case only those states that rows that have the state of Illinois. Okay. And it's interesting to pick apart the syntax that was automatically generated by that dialog, right? You have this attention paid to a return value. We're going to talk about return values in a little bit, so let's just table that for a moment. Also, whenever the execution is the exec statement here, we are receiving a value. So by default, whenever you execute a stored procedure, it's going to want to return a return value. We've ignored it in the past, in the previous video, but we can accept it. Now in this case, the return value is 0 because in the body of our stored procedure, we never set the return value to anything, so by default it's going to be 0. Again, table that discussion. We'll talk about return values and what they can be used for a little bit later in this video. All right, so then the other part of this is the input parameter and setting its value to, in this case, Illinois. Now, the N in front of this, I believe, is the nullable notation. So it's a string that can be used as a nullable varchar. Okay, so it's just another escape sequence put right before that single tick to denote a literal string in transxSQL. And typically when I do this, I write it more like that. And it makes sense to me, but it's a stylistic choice that the developers of the SQL Server team prefer to put that on another line. Perfectly fine, right? Can't argue with them. So let's just write this syntax ourselves, and we're going to leave out the return value and some of these other things and see if it'll work. Because I'm not quite as formal as they are, and that may not be a good thing, but if I just wanted to execute this stored procedure and pass in the input parameter, I would probably use this syntax, a little less formal, to accomplish just that. So get customers by state, and then I'm just going to pass in Texas and execute. So notice that the difference in all the syntax that they use versus what I use to get similar results. Okay? In this case, I did not preface it by doing that, but I believe it'll work. Whoops. If I do that. So let's try it again. Yep, it works. So to avoid ambiguity in your list of input parameters, if you have multiples, it might be useful to use that name value pair instead of just using the value and allowing the ordinal value of the input parameter to be utilized. Avoiding ambiguity is always a good thing. Okay, so at any rate, that is the basic syntax for creating a single input parameter for a stored procedure. But what if we were to create a new stored procedure? Let's just start here from scratch, and I'm going to type for a little while. So cue the music. You might want to turn down the volume if you don't like it. Or if you have people sitting in the cube next to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute this and see. All right, looks like it created successfully. Just to kind of catch you up on what I did here, you can see I used multiple input parameters for my stored procedure. Used the basic insert syntax, and instead of hard coding the values, I used all of the input parameters we defined above for that purpose. Okay, so that's awesome. Let's go ahead and demonstrate how I would actually call this stored procedure. Let's create a new query window. So I might do something like this, and I think, yeah, here we'll just, I may have to reference this list to execute this correctly. So here we go. See what else is after that. Email, credit limit, and customer since. Okay. All right, so we have apparently a new customer, but we have no way of knowing what its where the customer is. So I may have to do something like this. Select star from customers where last name equals Tabor, and hope that we don't have that many Tabors in the database. All right, looks like I've done this a couple of times. I'm guessing that last one would be the right one. But is there a better way to do that? Well, yes. Well, first of all, that's how you would create multiple parameters. This is how you would then call and pass in multiple parameters, just using a comma to separate the input parameters. So let's talk about output parameters for one moment here. Let's change this, and I'm going to change from create to alter, and then I'm going to add customer ID, and it's going to be an integer, and I'm going to use this other keyword called output. All right, so now what I'm going to do is scroll to the bottom of this, and I'm going to say select customer ID equal to add identity, which is a special keyword. You can see it shows up in pink there. That should return us the last value that was returned from, or that was inserted into that particular table for the given instance or connection for this application. And there are some nuances there that I said, but don't let that scare you. It's accurate most of the time, okay? And when it's not, then you can deal with that in the future. But at any rate, when we change to do this, let's re-execute this now, because we've changed the signature, and we're going to need to change then how we actually call this. Let's change this from Bob to Robert so we can find it easily. That's the first thing we're going to do. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable within our SQL, similar to what we saw that dialog do a little bit earlier, a few moments ago. So we're going to call this output. We call it anything we want as int. All right, so that's the first step. Then we're going to have our exec insert customer, and the very first thing we're going to do is say output. And then we're going to use that same keyword output. So this will retrieve back to us that customer ID that was just inserted into the database. And then finally, we'll do this, select output. So now it's going to looks a lot like what we saw that dialog created. It's almost identical. So let's execute this now. And you can see the only thing we get back is the new ID. So let's do this. Let's use our little test code here, where customer ID equals 109, and then let's see if it gets back Robert Tabor. And it does. So that worked. So that's how you define an output parameter. You can have multiple output parameters. We just chose to define one, you'd use the same sort of syntax with the commas to separate where we're executing them from, and we would define them the same way here with output parameter, output as the keyword there. Okay. So let's do this now. Instead of using an output parameter to capture that customer ID, let's go ahead and get rid of that. And down here at the bottom, we're just going to say, and use this keyword, return. So we're going to return at identity. And now, so let's execute that. Let's go back to our code here, and we're going to call this return value. And then we're going to remove it from here, and we're going to put it here. There we go. I lost my mind for a brief moment. Okay, so here we go. You can see we've declared our return value, and here exact return value equals insert customer, which again is the name of the stored procedure, and then all the parameters. And then finally we want to select it so that it displays it on screen. Okay, so why would you use a return value versus an output parameter? Well, typically return values are used to give information back to the calling application to let it know the success or the failure of the operation as a whole. So you might cook up some little scheme of 0 or 1 or a number of return codes that were 1001 or 1002, and each of those would be used within the body of your stored procedure to denote a certain error condition or a certain success condition. So it's just a way of giving feedback. You typically wouldn't use it just to return a customer ID. This is a pretty innocuous example that I just did right here. Whenever we use stored procedures within our applications using ADO.NET, you can see how you can retrieve that return value and then use a switch statement to determine how you should interpret the results that came back from the stored procedure. Not going to cover that for quite some time. Just wanted to give you a heads up on the difference between an output parameter and a return value. I would prefer, if you're returning just the customer ID, use an output parameter instead. Okay, so now that we've looked at stored procedures for a little while, I want to start wrapping our SQL Server discussion up, and I want to move back into C#, and I want to start making the two work together. And so in the next video, I want to discuss the differences between the two editions of SQL Server that are available to you within Visual C# 2010 Express Edition. And then finally, I want to chat at a high level about the various ways that you can access your SQL Server databases from within your C# and .NET applications. So that's a very important discussion. It's what we've been leading up to, marrying these two worlds together, and we'll talk about that in the next two videos. So thank you. We'll see you there.